YouTube, por favor. Gracias. Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas tardes. Estamos en el último panel de este día, 6 de noviembre. Es el panel Construcción de Paz Transformativa, Justicia Restaurativa en la intersección de género, raza y trauma. Este panel ha sido organizado por el Centro para la Justicia y la Construcción de Paz de la Eastern Mennonite University. Estamos muy contentas de tenerles aquí con nosotros. Y bueno, voy a presentar a quien será nuestro moderador del panel, que es el doctor Vernon Janchi, que es profesor emérito de Sociología de esta universidad, de la Eastern Mennonite University. Él ha ayudado a la implementación de programas para responder al impacto del conflicto y el trauma generados por la desintegración social, y se ha dedicado últimamente a fortalecer la resiliencia de las comunidades y grupos en un compromiso por la reconstrucción de la estructura del tejido social. Actualmente también promueve programas educativos sobre trauma y el impacto social, económico y emocional en las comunidades y en los individuos. Ha vivido y trabajado en Latinoamérica y en países como Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Perú, Chile y México. Tiene un PhD, un doctorado en Sociología del Desarrollo y de la Universidad de Cornell en los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica. Muchas gracias, doctor Vernon. Muchas gracias a las panelistas invitadas. Comenzamos.
I'm getting it here. Thank you, Elvia. It's nice to be here with everyone today, and we welcome you to our session. Elvia indicated that the title we've given it is Transformative Peacebuilding, Restorative Justice at the Intersection of Gender, Race, and Trauma. And our panel consists of two of my colleagues from Eastern Mennonite University, the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding, and a colleague from New Zealand and Australia, and I will introduce them in a bit as we go through the session. As I said, the organizing theme of our session is transformative peace building. We could ask, isn't all peace building transformative? And we'd probably have to say yes in some sense, but not necessarily. We emphasize the transformative because we would like to be very explicit about recognizing and making central the structural transformation that needs to occur as we work at trying to deal with harms both at the individual and collective levels, and try to reweave the social fabric in relation to the consequences of violence. And in our panel today, we'll be looking specifically at gender-based violence as our focus. So our session will be divided in two parts. First, we will hear from each of the panelists, and then we will have time for questions and comments for the panelists or among ourselves, panel as well. We can do that. And we will use Zoom or YouTube. I think there'll probably be instructions if we need that for the questions and comments. So our panelists, and I will say more when I introduce each of them, our panelists in the order in which they will occur are Shirley Julich, Thea Deacon Greenwood, Carolyn Stauffer, and Johanna Turner. So I will introduce them with their formal titles. So as I said, our first panelist is Dr. Shirley Julich from New Zealand. And Dr. Julich is a senior lecturer in the School of Health and Social Services at Massey University near Auckland. And Shirley publishes in the area of sexual violence and restorative justice, and is particularly interested in justice and the recovery from all forms of sexual harm. Shirley was on the advisory council for the Center for Justice and Peace Development at Massey University, the Albany campus, from 2002 to 2006, and was a member of the advisory board and management board for the Restorative Justice Center at the AUT University from 2006 to 2011. She is a member of Te Ori Tenga, New Zealand's first restorative justice provider group that worked. She was there from 1995 to 2000, and she is a founding member and trust board member of Project Restore, a community-based provider group using restorative processes to address sexual violence. She will talk a little bit today about her program in her presentation, which she's entitled Justice and Equality, Can Restorative Justice Deliver? Okay, Shirley?
Thank you, Vernon. So I'm assuming that everybody can see my screen now. It would be good if somebody could tell me, because I can't see you now. Can you see me, Vernon? Can you see my screen, Vernon? Thank you. So, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome. I bring you warm Pacific greetings. Today I want to talk about justice and equality from the perspective of sexual abuse survivors navigating the criminal justice space. Be mindful that talking about sexual violence can be triggering, so please do look after yourself if this is the case for you. Before I start, a word on terminology. I use the term victim survivor to depict the person who's been victimized by sexual violence. Project Restore uses terminology such as person harmed and person responsible. Call me a victim feminist if you will, but I use the term offender to acknowledge that sexual violence is a crime, but do so knowing that very few perpetrators are ever brought before the courts, and so the offender status has not been proven. So in my research over the years, I've asked victim survivors what would provide them with an experience of justice. It remains unchanged. They've told me they wanted to have their stories heard in a safe forum. They wanted the offender to accept responsibility and demonstrate accountability. They wanted to hear him or her say, I did that. It was my fault. I'm responsible, not you. I'm the one to be held accountable. They wanted their victimization to be validated by the offender and other important people in the family and their social systems. That is, they wanted vindication. They wanted the underlying causes of offending addressed, and very importantly, they needed these relationships to be transformed so they could coexist with the offender in any shared community. Not surprisingly, being treated equally is important to victims of sexual violence. The challenge is to provide justice across two different groups with very different needs, victims and offenders. There are two approaches to equality. The first is to treat all people the same, formal equality or equality of access. This ensures we're all equal in the eyes of the law. However, this does not guarantee equality of outcome, particularly for members of marginalised groups. Deeply entrenched power imbalances in our world are likely to preclude any formal equality, let alone substantive equality for survivors of sexual violence. The second approach is to accommodate the differences between people by treating people differently according to their needs. That is equality of outcome or substantive equality. And it's this notion of substantive equality that underpins CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And of course, it also reflects Aristotle's vision of justice, which was to treat like people alike and unlike people unalike. Substantive equality or equality of outcome acknowledges that we might have to treat people differently if we are to provide a level playing field. Facilitators aiming to provide a forum based on substantive equality therefore need to recognise and accommodate the impacts of victimisation and understand that the victim and offender might at times be treated differently. So in my initial research, I asked victim survivors of child sexual abuse what processes would best provide them with an experience of a sense of justice. Some mentioned the New Zealand Family Group Conference or other similar processes, but they didn't embrace restorative justice as I had anticipated, and they were sceptical that it would work in their family. I concluded that the concerns they raised would have to be addressed before restorative justice could be used effectively with sexual violence. Among others, these included.
Yes? Shirley, are you sharing your screen or not?
I am.
Okay, we're not seeing it. I'm sorry. So try again.
You saw it the first time.
No, I didn't see it. I just saw you. I'm sorry. I gave you bad information.
Okay. So you can see it now?
No, I can't see yours. I can just see you, not your screen.
Can anybody else see my screen?
No.
No.
Oh, why is that?
Okay, now Shirley.
You can
I
see
think
it
it's
now?
coming. Yes, I think yes.
Oh, excellent.
It now
Okay.
says concerns of victim survivors.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
All right. So I concluded that the concerns that they raised would have to be addressed before restorative justice could be used effectively with sexual violence. And among others, these included, as much as they wanted, victim survivors need to be ready to confront the offender. Complicating this is any pre-existing relationship with the offender, a relationship which is not premised on equality, and so a power imbalance will always exist. This is usually significant, but it might be very subtle. Victim survivors noted that offenders, particularly those who sexually abuse children, are master manipulators and are well practiced. And they were concerned that restorative justice facilitators with limited experiences of the dynamics of sexual violence would not be able to sufficiently support and empower victims to break down the constructs of denial. The concept of community was important for victim survivors. There are differences between communities, different levels of ability, and differing access to resources. Victim survivors were concerned as to who would attend a restorative conference. These were the very people who were unable to protect them in the first instance. Note that most people are sexually violated by someone known to them. Victim survivors were concerned that the cost of realising justice would be transferred to the community, or that restorative justice could become a cheap form of justice. Restorative justice in New Zealand is not providing full-time employment for most facilitators. Some do this work on top of other roles. Survivors were concerned that this could mean more unpaid or low-paid work for women, not only in their involvement as facilitators, but also they were concerned that women could become the unpaid supervisors of offenders in their family system with the responsibility of keeping everyone safe. Survivors, therefore, weren't supportive of the transfer of power to the community without appropriate structures in place to ensure women and children were not further disadvantaged. Victim survivors were concerned that the process would not challenge any of the rape myths, that is, minimising the offending or offering explanations that blame the victim. Just a word on neutrality. Neutral means not making comments or appearing to take sides or supporting any one of the stakeholders in the process of restorative justice. Impartiality means fairness, and balanced partiality means challenging these misperceptions if they occur. I'll return to these concerns shortly, but let's first look at how Project Restore delivers justice and equality. Project Restore uses their preferred practice model as a modified version of New Zealand's conferencing model, which has been expanded to include a restorative justice facilitator and 2 community specialists. All these people have in-depth understanding of each other's roles. Processes are collaboratively and carefully developed for each and every case, and we've used over the years a variety of different processes. Some processes, of course, are yet to be discovered. But I just want to make a disclaimer that note that New Zealand's conferencing model is not actually based on Māori models as it is often presented in the overseas literature. It's a Western model derived from the family group conference of our youth justice system, which is a Western model or a family-centered model. Having said that, we have facilitated conferences for other ethnic groups and for Māori groups. Our clinical team works meetly, and it consists of restorative justice facilitators who are accredited by the Ministry of Justice to work in the New Zealand District Court system, victim survivor specialists and offender specialists who are trained counsellors or therapists working in their particular field of expertise. And the clinical team is supervised by a clinical psychologist who doesn't have any direct contact with the clients. So all cases, those that are referred by the district court system and those that are referred by the community, therefore bypassing reports to the police, are assessed by this team. An aim of these weekly team meetings is to review all cases and debrief completed cases. In so doing, new learnings, development of knowledge, or new understandings can be incorporated into practice, thus ensuring the evolution of practice development. We've recently completed 2 cases via Zoom, and that was because of the pandemic when we were in shutdown earlier this year. And as you can imagine, this brings new risks and new learnings. So I want to give you some examples of justice outcomes for victims, survivors of child sexual abuse. And I'll start with the criminal court, and I'll finish with a typical story from Project Restore. So this is Paula. She's given me permission to tell her story and to use her picture. She'd been sexually abused by an uncle throughout her childhood, waiting some 30 years to report to the police. And this picture was taken the day she was sexually abused for the first time. In the year following her disclosure, there were many hearings in the district court, and one blurred into another, and she had little understanding of their purpose. At one of the court appearances, she was told that initially her uncle would plead not guilty. His lawyer had made application to have the case moved to the High Court, where he intended to enter an abusive process argument. That is, the case was too old for the uncle to mount an adequate defence. If this argument was not successful, he would plead guilty. However, the argument was successful, and it resulted in a stay of proceedings. Paula's family remains fractured and polarised, and Paula and her family continue to cope with the aftermath of child sexual abuse. This is not justice. Consider Robert. He too has given me permission to tell his story and to use his picture. Sexually abused throughout his childhood by his uncle, the same person who had abused Paula, and with her, he too reported to the police. Following a stay of proceedings in the criminal case, he continued to pursue an experience of justice. And he said, in the absence of a sense of justice from the criminal justice system, he sought a more symbolic compensation for the sexual abuse he'd been subjected to by taking a civil action in the Auckland High Court. Despite his stance some year prior in the criminal case, Robert's uncle admitted the charges and threw himself on the mercy of the court. The case was settled out of court and compensation was agreed by way of a mortgage over his uncle's matrimonial property. Robert could only benefit on the death of his uncle, but if the abuser were to predecease his wife, Robert's aunt, she would have to vacate the family home of more than 40 years. This is not justice either. So contrast these with Daisy's experience, sexually abused by her father throughout her childhood. She was referred to Project Restore by her therapist. So this case bypassed the police reporting. Much preparation followed of all intending participants for what ended up as 2 conferences over a period of 2 years. In the first restorative conference, Daisy's father agreed to enter into a treatment program. The family agreed to support him. It should be noted that Daisy's therapy and her father's treatment were not provided by Project Restore, but rather by expert community agencies and a private provider. On completion of the offender treatment program some 18 months later, the second restorative conference was convened. Daisy and other family members told their stories in a forum that minimised the risk for any re-victimisation. Daisy's father now had the capacity to discuss what is sexual harmful behaviour, the impacts, and to demonstrate understanding on all those harmed, including the secondary victims, that's the other family members. Further, he was able to accept responsibility and accountability. He discussed a safety plan developed in the treatment program in case he came in contact with children, which meant all those attending the conference were aware of the plan. A profound mutual understanding can be one of those magic moments of a restorative conference of which so many facilitators speak. And it's a moment when sometimes a deep apology can be given and received. The outcomes of the second conference were the commitment by the family to continue providing support to Daisy. Her father and others are harmed by the sexual abuse, negotiating ongoing relationships with each other, and finally agreeing to continue supporting each other as they moved forward. They also agreed to provide by the protocols around future interactions that were developed in the conference. This case took 2 years from beginning to end, and Daisy's father continues to be committed to the action plans that were developed in the second restorative conference. This is justice, and this couldn't have been achieved in our conventional criminal justice system. So I just want to finish by coming back to survivors' concerns regarding the use of restorative justice with sexual violence. I strongly believe Project Restore overcomes these concerns. Most are mitigated by the use of specialists, the survivor specialist, the offender specialist, and the restorative justice facilitator, all of whom are specialists in their fields and have an in-depth understanding of the dynamics of sexual violence. And they also understand each other's fields. The preparation of all potential participants is prioritised, and cases don't proceed until Project Restore is confident that both victim and offender and their community of care or support are ready to come together. The preparation stage takes time, and this is difficult when working to the timetables of the courts. Project Restore is not neutral, but it is impartial, and it creates a safe environment for everyone, which is their priority. And it does balanced partiality by intervening if explanations are gendered-based, blaming the victim, minimising offending behaviour, or contributing to the construct of denial. Tēnā koutou katoa, kia ora. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
You're muted, Vernon.
Thank you very much, Shirley. We will take questions or comments from participants after everyone else has shared. So if you have questions or you have some comments, you might make a note of that so that later you'll be able to share that with us. Our next presenter is Thea Deacon-Greenwood from Australia. She is a lawyer who has been practicing in the community legal sector in New South Wales, Australia for over 15 years. Her work has mainly been with women and children who are survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, most recently in connection to the National Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Assault. In 2019, she completed a Churchill Fellowship investigating victim-oriented and community-based restorative justice programs for sexual assault in 5 international jurisdictions. Thea works in collaboration with Dr. Jane Bolito, who is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of New South Wales and has recently been appointed to Deanna Unwin Chair of Restorative Justice in Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. Together, they have recently established the Cicada Project, a victim-oriented and community-based restorative justice response to sexual and domestic violence. Her topic today is community-based restorative responses to sexual violence. Thea?
Thank you, Vernon. Thank you very much. And thank you, Shirley, as well for that wonderful presentation. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. How is that? Yes, I'm going to assume that that's fine. I'd just like to acknowledge I'm joining you from Australia, and my name is Thea. You might be familiar with this map of Australia, but probably not all of the different nations. So this represents the Aboriginal nations of my country and the First Nations people. You can see how many different cultures, communities, language groups, and diversity that we have in Australia. And also, people may not know that Australia, Aboriginal cultures here are amongst the oldest living cultures in the world, and that this land was never ceded, and that it was, and always will be Aboriginal land. There's many past policies and practices that have attempted to destroy Aboriginal culture, but it thrives and is a beautiful culture in spite of this. But restorative practices in Australia are complex to talk about because we've had no formal truth telling in this country and no process of reckoning for the things that have happened here. I'm joining you from Darug and Gundungurra country, which is the Blue Mountains just outside of Sydney. And I'm just going to go back to my normal screen. Okay, thank you. So yes, I'm a lawyer, and I'm talking about restorative today. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about my pathway into restorative justice, to set out some of the barriers that survivors of sexual violence have in accessing justice, and to explain how we're adopting a victim-oriented and community-based framework to work restoratively. I should just start by saying that there's no formal restorative justice process for sexual violence in my state or in most parts of Australia. There's practices in the youth space, but there's not a formal restorative practice in the community. So I'm not an academic, I'm a lawyer, but I usually say that I'm not the kind of lawyer that you might have in mind. I work in the community sector, and community legal centres in Australia are government funded legal centres, and we provide free services to people in the community. My work has always been with gendered violence, with sexual violence, child sexual assault. And as Vernon mentioned, my previous role was to work in collaboration with the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual assault. And that Royal Commission process, which ran for 5 years, heard from over 8,000 individual victims of child sexual assault that had occurred in institutional settings, and received over 25,000 submissions from people who had experiences of child sexual assault. There, I really got to see the barriers that people had in accessing justice, and particularly for children, in being able to be able to disclose and have their story supported and to have appropriate responses. Before that work, I worked at Warringah, which is a statewide legal service for Aboriginal women and children. I mainly helped preparing victims for crimes compensation or victims compensation. And I saw how barriers such as race and gender, location of whether or not you lived in a regional or urban or rural part of Australia, and how race particularly provides many barriers to justice. I also helped establish a prison program for women who are incarcerated. And that was a really formative experience for me in seeing how early experiences of particularly child sexual assault led to ongoing institutionalization, and for many women, incarceration. And that many people who are in prison who have been convicted of sometimes really serious harms were often victims first. And how these early life experiences can, in many cases, can ruin relationships and opportunities and life expectancy as well. My current work is, I'll talk about at the end, about how we're trying to utilise our restorative practices in our community. But a really strong pathway for me into restorative has been from listening to my clients, listening to their voices, and responding to their experiences and recognising their needs. So I've always seen how voice and validation and acknowledgement in however we achieve that for our clients can be really powerful mechanisms for justice. And a colleague this week reminded me how there's many pathways into restorative justice, and all of these are really valid and meaningful, because restorative in sexual violence involves people and relationships, power imbalances and injustices, and seeking to rebalance these. And so it's completely logical that we come into restorative through different pathways and different motivations. For me as a lawyer, my pathway has been through recognising the limitations of the system that I'm a part of, and to provide other opportunities to survivors. In some ways, there's been quite a long realisation, because as Vernon mentioned, I've been working as a solicitor for 15 years, but it's really only in recent times that restorative has become really affirmed for me in the way in which it can provide a better framework for justice. So I feel like I'm at the beginning of my learning, and I'm really pleased to be sharing some of this, but also still at the feeling like, there's a lot to learn, particularly from the people in this panel. In my work in helping survivors access justice through whatever means, it's usually been in helping them prepare statements and written materials to support their case or their claim, to help them access counselling. And I've witnessed many hundreds, if not thousands, of descriptions of sexual abuse and disclosures of violence. That sentence was quite difficult to write and quite hard to say. But in doing that, and in contrast to the justice that's been offered by the criminal system, I have seen how giving voice and agency, recognising and validating people's experiences and giving them options can lead to empowerment. And I've also seen how traditional pathways to justice have often insurmountable barriers and many bias against gender and race, location, class, and age. And when I work with my clients who have experienced complex trauma, my starting point is about trust and about belief. But the criminal legal system starts with a position of disbelief and the presumption of innocence. And while I understand why that is the case, in working with complex trauma and people who have experienced usually child sexual assault, we start with belief, and it's the the mismatch between that system and the criminal legal system. So when somebody discloses to me, my starting point is to say that I believe you, and it wasn't your fault, and what do you want? And when I ask people what they want to add to Shirley's list, my clients also say that they want the violence to stop, that they don't want what happened to them to happen to anybody else, and they want the person to get help. And in trying to help people realise these things, there's some powerful tools that we can use. As a lawyer, I work very hard to only do what I say I'm going to do and not to overpromise. I work very hard to develop trust and rapport, and I treat my clients as experts in their lives. I recognize their strength and their resilience as survivors. And in working compassionately with their trauma, I also ask things like, is there anything that I can do to help you with these things? But in asking that question, it's really clear that the answer rarely lies in the traditional criminal justice system. But that is really the only formal justice available in New South Wales and in my country and in many places. Just to kind of comment on the legal process that Shirley talked about as well, the starting point to start a criminal process is to disclose, which often takes many years and sometimes decades. A number of my clients have been well into their 70s when they have first disclosed child sexual abuse, and that is the toll that secret keeping takes on people's lives. So to start down a criminal pathway means first to report to the police. And for many people who've had very poor experiences of the police or because of stigma, this is just not an option. But even if it was, the next step would be to have the police lay charges and at some point maybe have a trial. In Australia, sexual violence is the crime with the highest rate of acquittal. Of the reported cases, less than 1% result in conviction. There's high attrition of these matters through the criminal system, even once a prosecution has started. And so the uncomfortable truth is that most people responsible for sexual violence are living and working in our community. These people are our brothers, fathers, uncles, partners, family members, neighbours, and colleagues. And even if prison does take people out of community for a period of time, the uncomfortable truth is that most people will come out of jail and they'll be living in our communities again. So the question that we're trying to ask is, how does our current system keep people safe? And is there a better way? So my view as a lawyer is that if the system of law we have is so limited, then we need to look outside our traditional criminal frameworks to see how else to better support and respond to our clients and our friends, our family members, and to survivors everywhere. And I believe that we all have a contribution in responding to complex harm, because people don't just have legal problems or health problems, they have things that have happened in their life that they need to help with. And as a community, we need to work together. Lawyers and activists, counsellors, restorative practitioners, social workers, psychologists, and academics to create the system that we want. And that our responses need to be holistic and need to involve lots of skills of lots of people and the community as well, to help solve what are problems that the community are dealing with. And so community justice can be a powerful mechanism in this. So how are we doing this? In my work, we're bringing together research and practice. During my research, I observed many different types of restorative work taking place around the world as part of my Churchill Fellowship. And as Vernon mentioned, my colleague Jane Belitho has done extensive research on the elements of best practice. And I'd agree with all of the observations that Shirley made in her seminar. And we're looking at how some of these can be applied in New South Wales. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen again. And just go through some of the practices that I observed overseas. So in the United States, there's practices like the Contra Costa Family Justice Center in Richmond in California, which is bringing together a model developed by Impact Justice and looking at often lateral violence in communities where there's intergenerational violence taking place, where people have experiences of both victimization and perpetration of violence, working with communities and developing training and resources for other community agencies to take on this work to ensure that there's community accountability. In New York City, I met with a service that works exclusively with child sexual assault, This work is inspired by Hollow Water in Manitoba in Canada, and uses circle processes to include all of the people harmed and impacted by sexual violence. So the person who's been harmed and the person who's responsible for the harm, as well as non-offending parents, children, partners, siblings, and to provide circle restorative processes for all of those people to get support and to talk about the impact of the harm on them. This process then also sometimes involves bringing people back together into group circles once they've all had an opportunity to have their own restorative process. The concept behind Hidden Water is that all people cause harm and all people are harmed, and that we actually need to provide care and support and a process for all of those people. Another service I met with was called Community Justice Initiatives, which is based in Ontario in Canada. And they provide a really holistic, widespread programs for all types of people connected to sexual violence in both community and in prisons, referred from the court as well. And again, they work really holistically and provide therapeutic and case management and services for all people across the spectrum who are impacted by sexual violence. In the UK, a service called the Thames Valley Restorative Justice Service have developed a best practice framework, which has been adopted by the national government there. They also work in community and in prisons and have trained practitioners and guards in some prisons to use restorative practices in their jail. And it's actually seen a reduction in harm and prison disturbances in the prison. And of course, in Project Restore, as Shirley mentioned, we're really taking a lot of inspiration from our colleagues in New Zealand. The three-legged stool model that Project Restore has developed is a really powerful mechanism. And we've got so much to learn from this model and are working closely with practitioners connected to Project Restore. And I'm just going to come out of that screen again. So what are we doing in community in my state to bring all of this learning and all of this work together? So Jane and I have been working together for the past couple of years, and our process has involved hundreds of meetings with all community stakeholders connected to sexual violence. We've met with judges and lawyers, sexual assault counsellors, victim survivor support groups, police, community workers, various agencies, Aboriginal services, and there's a common understanding amongst all of those people that our criminal system is broken and it doesn't address justice needs of victims, and we need to do something to fix it. As a community organisation, we're not waiting for government to do this. And as a community lawyer and a community service, we're working with an academic to take these steps ourselves by combining research and practice and designing a system that our clients who are survivors are telling us that they want. We want to design a system that listens to victims and provides responses that are meaningful, that holds people responsible to account, and provides access to treatment and resources that can help stop them being harmful. Counselling and support for survivors and to help support them is the centre of that response, and this project we're calling the Cicada Project. This is centred around the needs and the views and the voices of victims, and we've developed an expert panel to help us advise us on the next way forward. People with lived experience are key to this, and in the next year we'll be developing the model that we want to implement in New South Wales. So we are asking government for support, but we actually aren't waiting for it. We're providing workshops and training, seminars, intensive training modules for community, for practitioners, and for survivors who want to understand restorative justice, and for some of them to become practitioners. We're building a workforce and finding allies in other services, in other fields and other disciplines who are allies in doing this work. And we're working directly with victims. We're developing many partnerships, and these are not just with agencies that support victim survivors, but also for services that work in prison and for people who have caused harm. We're committed to changing the system that we've got and developing a demonstration pilot project, which we hope will be supported by evidence. And we continue to advocate for services not only for victims, but also for the people who are responsible for harm. because we believe that for a safe society and for a society and a community that we want, we actually need to take care of everybody. And so we're just at the beginning of this journey, but we are very hopeful, and we've started small, and we're building support and trying to be the change that we want to see. So thank you very much for including me in this seminar, and I really look forward to speaking with you later.
Thank you very much, Thea. It's exciting to hear what you're doing. Again, I encourage you to write your questions down or comments, things that you would like to bring back to the panel at the end of our time. I want you to feel comfortable and move around if you need to and so forth, to be sure that you're relaxed enough to be able to remember all the things you want to remember. Our next panelist is Dr. Carolyn Stauffer from Harrisonburg, Virginia, in the United States. She is a consultant and educator in the fields of sexual trauma and domestic violence, and is Associate Professor of Applied Social Sciences at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Stauffer has trained sexual assault response teams, civil society groups, and gender-based violence organizations on 4 continents. She has lived and worked in the Middle East for 15 years, in Africa for 16 years, and has been the primary investigator on 3 competitive grants. Stauffer has 20 years of practice experience with a focus on enhancing survivor resilience through a strengths-based approach. Her presentation is entitled Centering Survivor Assets, 3 Case Studies of Critical Hope. Kelly?
Thank you, Vernon. I'm going to screen share here and move into our time together. Vernon, can you give me a thumbs up if you see this? Wonderful. Well, a warm greeting to each of you who are sharing this space and are contributing to this virtual community. I want to say that I feel tremendously honored to join this gathering. I know there are folks that are being streamed in from all parts of the globe. In the brief time that I have with you today, I'm going to be focusing on the work of an initiative called the Silent Violence Project. The Silent Violence Project, which started about a decade ago, and which I like to characterize as a story web for female survivors of sexual violence. In order to introduce you to this project, I want to begin by inviting you to focus on the verbiage in front of you, the Silent Violence Project. As you mull over these words in your head, here are some questions for us to consider. What makes some forms of sexual harm more silent than others? What happens when sexual harm survivors are silenced? What forms of sexual harm may be invisible to you? Now let me invite you to again reconnect with the visual in front of you, and specifically to focus on the keyhole image and its placement. The Silent Violence Initiative, essentially, as was previously mentioned, is a story web, but our focus was on amplifying 2 survivor assets, voice and choice. Voice precisely becomes because some forms and locations of sexual harm are often erased and or silenced, and choice because choice signals a reinstatement of survivors' power and agency. So my gratitude to each of you as we move forward in this journey. In the tradition of a recognition of land, I'd like to take some time to honor some forerunners who have carved out the conceptual terrain, the sort of ideological land of this research. These are the ancestors to whom I am very much indebted. And so I'd like to read out their names and identify one key idea from each of them as a form of recognition. Kimberly Crenshaw, Gayatri Spivak, Angela Davis, Kimberly Thieden, Dolores Huerta, Saba Mahmoud. Over the duration of my professional life, all the research initiatives that I've been a part of have had two things in common. The first one is that they have been community-based, and the second one is that they have been community-driven. And in light of that, I'd like to give credit where credit is due to the activists and scholars that have been a part of the Silent Violence Initiative. Here are their names. I'd like to give a particular shout out to Katia Ornelas and my brilliant colleague, Dr. Johanna Turner, who's going to be presenting after me. Katia was one of the original members of the team to work on this project. And so she's going to be presenting along with Dr. Turner again later this week. So look out for her. I'd also like to highlight some foundational ideas that help frame the research. The first one is critical race theory. And here I'm indebted to Patricia Hill Collins in her 1986 work entitled Learning from the Outsider Within, but more so 30 years later, she revisited it with her 2016 piece entitled Black Feminist Thought as Oppositional Knowledge. And you'll be able to pick up on this idea of oppositional knowledge because we were looking specifically for its emergent within the narratives of our participants in this initiative. The second one is a feminist standpoint theory. And here we picked up on the work of Tracy Bowell from the University of Waikato in New Zealand. She suggests that there are a number of epistemologies that are characteristic of this space and feminist space specifically. And she talks about the fact that knowledge is socially situated. And here, social location, positionality, context makes all the difference. She also talks about the fact that lived experiences of minoritized groups are vital locations of knowledge generation. And you'll find that that's a key construct in terms of the groups that were involved in this project. And third of all, she talks about the fact that social research validity is enhanced by a focus on power relations, and particularly those that originate in the experiences of anti-oppression movements. And this is important in terms of how we conceptualize sexual violence, not just as an individual perpetrator pathology, but rather frequently as a product of structural and state-induced violence. And this is the theme that was surfaced throughout our research. Counter stories. Here I want to speak to a tradition of thought, moving from hidden and concealed stories to narratives of resistance and counter stories. Here we picked up on the work of Lat Crit, which is Latinx critical race theorists such as Aja Martinez, Taro Yasso, and Daniel Sorozano in terms of methodologies of Lat Crit, Raul Mora in terms of counter narratives, and then Francisco Valdez, who explains the work of Lat Crit in this way, and I love this quote. He says, Lat Crits work both to create scholarship and activism through community and to create community through scholarship and activism. And I so appreciate his emphasis on the bidirectional flow of that. Lastly, the principle of ground truthing. Here I'm picking up on the work of Veronica Velez from the Center for Critical Race Studies at UCLA and her work on spatializing race and racializing space. So you're asking yourself, what are the critical elements of the Silent Violence Project? Our key question was, how does identity shape and influence experiences of sexual harm? And so what we did was we picked up on three elements that we were looking for in terms of the narratives that we gathered. The first one was risks. And here we were asking, how do survivors perceive risks other than just the risk of bodily harm? And here we picked up on the work of Sherry Hamby, incredible researcher who writes about expanding the definitions of risk. Also, we looked at resistance, what forms of resistance or oppositional knowledge, as Patricia Hill Collins calls it, did survivors generate and use? And lastly, what were the resilience practices, those agentic responses that were activated amongst survivors? And all of this came together in their counter stories and narratives. The Silent Violence Project, let me just give a little background from a research perspective. We used a grounded theory methodology employing a constructionist and inductive design. We used a chain referral process to select participants and conducted in-depth life story interviews with participants in their preferred language, generating over 400 pages of transcript on which narrative analysis was used to elicit and process recurrent discursive themes. And because our focus was on identity and the impacts of social location on experiences of sexual harm, we wanted to work with a number of different frames. And so we picked race, class, and gender as those frames, and groups that we thought would experience sexual harm from those lenses. And so for class, we worked with homeless survivors. With race, and I use that very generally, here we were looking at ethnic identity, religious identity, citizenship status, all of these elements and how they interface with experiences of sexual harm. And then we wanted to look at gender in terms of how a religious discourse, and here specifically from Amish and Plain communities, how this influenced experiences of sexual violence, precisely because much of the religious discourse within that particular community disavows the option of divorce or oftentimes exit from abusive relationships. So what did we find? For homeless survivors, the counter stories that we picked up on in terms of risks, resistance, and resilience really focused on the fact that the state oftentimes pathologized the serial relocations that these women were making. And what that meant was that their resilient strategy, which was essentially this relocation and evasion, was pathologized by the state. And in many regards, we saw that these serial relocations were their survival strategies. And not only did they do that in terms of bodily relocation, but also psychological disassociation. And so this was the one group specifically that actually oftentimes used metaphors to talk about the abuse that they experienced. They also deployed this disorder in order to leverage their power against social and state structures. And what this meant was, here we were using the frame that James C. Scott uses in terms of his text of the weapons of the weak. And he reconceptualizes resistance, and he describes it as non-cooperation in these words: covert insubordinations, including foot dragging, evasion, non-compliance, pilfering, feigned ignorance, slander, and the use of rumor, gossip, disguises, linguistic tricks, metaphors, euphemisms, ritual gestures, folk tales, and clandestine anonymity. All of these were the types of efforts and initiatives that these women took on to resist not just their individual abusers, but the state incursions into their lives. And I want to read to you just a snippet from one woman that used disguise on a regular basis in order to protect herself. She said this: "I even made it onto a TV show, Wayne County's Most Wanted. It was right about the time that John was talking about the show called America's Most Wanted, and it was comical. I got all of these emergency phone calls. Mama was calling and saying, they had you on Wayne County's Most Wanted. And I said, you bullshit. For one freaking fucking gram of coke? I said, are you serious? And she's like, yep, but guess what? And I'm like, no, what's the surprise? And she says, They don't have a picture of you. They have a sentence saying that you change your style and appearance so much that they could never get an accurate picture, which I do, yes. And I just found a hairstylist, my daughter, and she didn't even know. But when I get bored with a look, I just change it up. And since I got this drawstring ponytails and a weave in this, I can be dead on near bald, and I change it up every day to be whoever I want to be. These women were deploying disruption and disorder as their survival mechanism. The next group that I just want to pick up on is the new immigrant survivors. These folks, their stories in terms of risks, they perceive the risks of detection, detention, and deportation as primary places of hazard, more so even than the risks of abuse. So let me just read several clips here from that. One woman said, it's more difficult for a person who doesn't have papers. I also think that if I had papers, I would feel safer with my daughters. Yes, because imagine if I had problems with him and I told them that, well, he's abusing me, and me being without papers, they check and they see that I don't have papers and they deport me. Another woman said, I know a lot of cases that women are abused, but they are afraid of the police. And actually, I'm also afraid of the police. We don't have anybody here to help, and we are afraid of being alone with the children, needing to pay the rent and the bills, caring and everything. So when this problem of abuse comes, we don't have options. A third woman says, I've had other experiences of sexual harassment at the workplace with coworkers. I think it's because I don't have documents, and many people try to humiliate me. So sometimes I endure all of the humiliation because I don't want to lose my job. That's the trouble with this country, that one cannot defend themselves. These women, precisely because they saw the threat of the state as one of their major hazards, they, in a serial way, they bypassed a lot of formal structures, help structures. For instance, calling 911, for instance, health services. They found other institutional brokers, oftentimes through the church, oftentimes through immigration lawyers. And what they did was they leveraged economic mobility opportunities. And this was in the form of a lot of verbiage that came out in terms of cash, cars, and keys. These were opportunity structures that these women were leveraging in order to get the power that they needed to leave abusive environments. I remember one woman, in terms of cash, she says this: he would take the money away from me, but sometimes I would hide a little by little. I would hide cash in my interior clothing, my womanly things, you know? But sometimes he would ask me where I'd gotten the money, and I would tell him, that's why I'm working. This was part of their resilience strategy. I'm going to wrap up here with our third group, Amish and Plain community members. Their counter stories were really about the minefield of membership and the insular nature of membership. And what's interesting here is that dresses became a metaphor. Distinctive dress for this community was a metaphor not only for the distinctiveness and the separateness of the community, and so protection from the outside world, but also dresses became not about just protection, they also became a site of predation. And here's what one woman says: we had a rule book that we lived by that was very strict. It laid out the detail of our lives. I mean, just every detail of our lives. Dress, you know, the women, we weren't allowed to have our elbows even showing. Lengthy sleeves, big coverings, thick coverings that were, you know, everything was underneath of that. And so, yeah, that was our standard. And that was the rule that we lived by. Another woman picks up on this and she says, it was as if the abuse was my fault. It was something that I was doing. It was maybe that I was dressing seductively. And if they ever found out what happened, then I would get beaten. And so I remember my mom coming to me one time and she's like, is this still happening? And I was like, no, not at all. And so I would threaten sometimes that I would tell on him. And I'm like, I'm going to tell on you while you're abusing me, you know? And he'd be like, no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, as he would stick his hand up my dress. We wore dresses, so we were accessible to them all the time. Damn dresses. Interestingly enough, the hazards of the power dynamics within these communities disallowed women to actually disclose to men folk in the community. From all the respondents within this community, they all just disclosed to women. And usually it was women who had other locations of power. And what we found was that midwives represented those locations of power. Precisely because they were socially sanctioned biological and social reproductive, they carried those roles within the community. So in terms of resilience, the disclosures happened oftentimes in terms of medically minded community members and midwives who had access to these women's bodies. So I'm going to close here. Just a reminder that oftentimes there are particular communities that are impacted by locations that have extraordinary and specifically positional dynamics that impact on the kinds of forms of violence that they experience. I'd like to close now with the words of civil rights activist, restorative justice doula, and transformative justice, which we're going to hear from Dr. Turner about, champion Dr. Fania Davis. She says this: let's walk this land, inhabit this space in ways that restore healing, wholeness, and holiness, instead of discord, devastation, and domination. If anybody wants any added information, you'll see the connection points at the bottom of the screen there. And I want to thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Very moving description, vivid descriptions of some of the people you interviewed. Thank you again. Again, I remind you to write your questions and comments, and later we will be able to share those with the appropriate people. Our final presenter is Dr. Johanna Turner, also from Harrisonburg in the US. Dr. Turner is an educator, scholar, public speaker, and trainer. She serves on the core faculty of Eastern Mennonite University's Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. She also co-directs the Zaire Institute for Restorative Justice. For over 15 years, she has worked as part of activist arts collectives, community organizing coalitions, faith-based institutions, and other social movement organizations to cultivate innovative approaches to justice and healing. Her work prioritizes the power of love, creativity, and collective action, and the need for both personal and social transformation. Dr. Turner holds a PhD in American Studies and a graduate certificate in Women's Studies from the University of Maryland, and a graduate certificate in Urban Youth Ministry from Fuller Theological Seminary. Some of her foremost teachers have been artists, educators, and organizers within social justice organizations and movements. Her scholarship, practice, and teaching interests include restorative and transformative justice, critical race feminism, faith-rooted social action, and personal and spiritual formation for social justice. Dr. Turner serves on the advisory board of Life Comes From It, a grant-making circle that helps to resource grassroots movement building work for restorative justice, transformative justice, and Indigenous peacemaking led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the United States. Dr. Turner's topic is Transformative Justice, a critical race feminist approach to racialized gender violence. Dr. Turner.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm also going to share my screen with all of you. I'm honored to be a part of this panel today And I especially appreciate how our presentations are layered, not side by side, but slightly overlapping. And I'll be continuing that with my presentation, picking up on many of the themes, in particular that Carolyn brought up, referencing some of the same scholars and some of the same approaches. As was shared, the title of my presentation is Transformative Justice, a Critical Race Feminist Approach to Racialized Gender Violence. I want to begin this presentation with a dedication. My mother is a brilliant leader. She spent 20 years as a nurse, a resilient woman, and she is also a survivor of domestic violence. Before and since the time she left a marriage that was abusive, she found care, solace, and the best of company in her best friend, Joyce, who died this morning. This presentation is in memoriam of her and in celebration of a life that gave radical love to my mother, her children, and so many, many, many more. About 15 years ago, I was working on my PhD in cultural studies at a large research university located just outside of Washington, D.C. And I was also active in community organizing and social justice activism based in and around the city. It was around that time, in 2004 to be exact, that I attended a workshop led by members of the Washington, D.C. area chapter of an organization then known as Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. The workshop was part of a campaign to engage everyday people in the work of addressing gender-based violence within our communities without relying on tactics and strategies of criminalization. Insight emerged from conversations among women of color who were active within racial justice movements against mass incarceration and police brutality, and from feminist movements that were working against domestic and sexual violence. Through their shared convenings, experiences, and observations, they began to identify significant gaps and challenges in each movement's ability to work towards safety and justice. Whereas movements against state violence, for example, movements for prison abolition and the anti-police brutality movement at that time focused almost exclusively on the violence that men of color experienced. This was about 15 years ago. Feminist movements to combat sexual and domestic violence centered nearly exclusively on the experiences of white women, particularly women who were also heterosexual and middle class. It became clear to many radical feminists of color that either movement was not addressing the needs of women of color, including the gendered nature of racial violence and the racialized nature of gender violence. Today, the organization, known most simply as Insight, continues as a network of radical feminists of color, organizing to end state violence and violence in our homes and communities. And the term radical is used in the tradition of civil rights activists Ella Baker and Angela Davis, radical to mean getting to the root. Insight embodies a critical race feminist approach to understanding violence against women of color, and has played a foundational role in advancing an approach to addressing gender violence known as transformative justice and community accountability. This presentation is informed by my experience learning from Insight and other organizations in the transformative justice movement, studying the resources created by this leaderful movement alongside traditional academic resources and synthesizing key lessons. In giving this presentation, I seek to serve as a bridge builder between activists and academic communities in order to share how transformative justice serves as a critical race feminist approach to addressing intimate violence experienced by women of color, which is both racialized and gendered. As someone whose primary work is teaching about restorative justice, the lessons of transformative justice have shaped my teaching, have shaped my analysis, and have shaped the ways that I teach about restorative justice. Likewise, I seek to bridge and connect activists and academic sites and resources for understanding and responding to intimate violence, disrupting this artificial binary. So in the forthcoming sections of this presentation, I'm going to provide a summary of critical race feminism, discuss goals of transformative justice, and highlight an example of practice beyond the work of insight that I've learned a lot from, and it provides an example of this critical race feminist approach to racialized gender violence. Legal scholar Angela Harris has argued that conventional approaches to restorative justice require the contributions of critical race feminism in order to address the interlocking realities of racial subordination and gender violence. Critical race feminism emerged from and includes core aspects of critical legal studies, critical race theory, which Dr. Stauffer referenced, and feminist theory, but also responds to the shortcomings of each approach. It is an analytical tool and a multidisciplinary approach that sees law as important but insufficient to understand and improve the legal plight and related social, political, and economic conditions of women of color in the US and around the world. And although the term is credited as originally coined by Richard Delgado in the first edition of his edited volume on critical race theory, its professors Adrienne Wing, Angela P. Harris, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Dorothy Roberts, who are among the leading theorists of critical race feminism. Critical race feminist approach centers the experiences and perspectives of women of color, not only because such a focus is beneficial to women of color, but it's also because of adherence to the Black feminist notion of radical humanism, which posits that everyone in a given society can enjoy the fruits of such efforts. And this is especially the case when we recognize how, quote, women of color are disproportionately stalled at the bottom of every society. I see the anti-subordinationist vision of critical race feminism as resting on 5 principles, which I'm going to briefly discuss, many of which are also shared with critical race theory and Black feminist theory. The first principle I call the PRISM principle. This is a principle connected to the analytical tool of intersectionality that posits that dimensions of social identity, such as race and gender, are socially constructed, they're multidimensional, and they're co-constituted, right? They do not exist separate from one another. The second principle is very much related to that principle, and I call it the plurality principle. And this is the idea that marginalization, oppression, and violence exist as overlapping and intertwined. They're pluralities that are overlapping and intertwined. They're not separate from one another, and that they therefore also require an intersectional analysis. This principle is captured, reflected through the notion that Patricia Hill Collins calls the matrix of domination. And the third is what I call the placement principle. And this states that women of color are placed and must be placed through critical race feminism, are placed at the center of theorizing, research, and practice. And in keeping with intersectionality, critical race feminism seeks to increasingly focus our experiences of those on the margins, or what I call the margins of margins, which may include poor and working class women of color, transgender women, women who have been involved or participated in the sex trade, who have migrant and refugee status, who have experiences of incarceration and confinement, and various experiences and vulnerabilities to violence as a result of those experiences and identities. And as Dr. Stauffer also referenced, this idea of the epistemology, epistemic kind of privilege of those who are oppressed, that critical race feminists believe that one's placement in relation to power and privilege can give one unique vantage points from which to see, analyze, theorize, and envision. So those who are placed in increasingly vulnerable positions are uniquely able to offer an emancipatory social analysis and vision. And then the fourth is what I call the planted principle. This is an idea related to kind of understanding systems of oppression, including white supremacy, including patriarchy, but not limited to those, as embedded or ingrained within societal institutions, including the state. Likewise, the law is never an objective tool for ameliorating social injustices. It's also been inflected with subordinationist values. Deacon Greenwood talked a little bit about that in her presentation as well. And then finally, this principle, the praxis principle, it captures this idea that social and political knowledge, to be relevant and useful, must be created through direct engagement in social and political struggle. So praxis is as we know it, is the symbiotic relationship between reflection and action. and the cyclical process by which we theorize through our practice and work from sustained study and reflection. So it calls those of us positioned in academia and similar kinds of institutions, not only to be working alongside individuals and communities whom we purport to affect, but also to understand emancipatory social movements as incubators of critical theory and praxis, and therefore to learn from those movements. And I seek to do that and reflect what I've learned as I continue in this presentation. Critical race feminists, of course, bring the stories of women and girls of color in particular into conversation with legislation and policy, as well as institutional norms, dominant theoretical frameworks and advocacy agendas in order to reveal flawed assumptions and blind spots. To return to my earlier discussion of the radical feminist of color organization Insight, Insight's founders recognized that women of color experience state and interpersonal violence that's proportionately and simultaneously. So for example, when undocumented women have called the police to report domestic violence, they've been arrested and deported, as Dr. Stauffer discussed in her presentation. Multiple survivors of gender-based violence have also been incarcerated when the actions they took to survive were criminalized. And even more broadly, efforts to expand policing and criminalization within communities of color in particular place those of us within those communities at higher risk of being arrested and incarcerated, which puts us at higher risk for experiencing sexual violence from routine strip searches to rape. Insight's founders saw a critical need for an anti-violence movement that centers women of color and addresses all forms of violence women of color and our communities experience, whether that violence is caused by law enforcement officials, intimate partners, invading armies, our neighbors. And that's a near quote from the work featured on the website and campaigns. So the analysis and strategies advanced by Insight have fundamentally challenged this increasing shift toward seeing the criminal legal apparatus and its expansion as a solution to gender-based violence, an approach that's become known as carceral feminism. And of course, as many of us have been connected to the work that's come out of this, these movements have recognized has been out of this a flourishing and promotion of a vision to end interpersonal and state violence, to recognize the interlocking nature of gendered and racialized violence, and a strategy of organizing for cultural and social change. The larger framework for advancing this vision, in particular strategies that enable this vision, have become known as transformative justice. For therapist, writer, and educator Nathaniel Shara, transformative justice is primarily defined and distinguished by its aims. And so I want to further define transformative justice through a discussion of its goals and ultimate vision. I met Nathaniel Shara through his connection and leadership with Generation 5, an organization founded by survivors of child sexual abuse. Their vision is to end child sexual abuse in 5 generations by connecting efforts for individual justice with efforts for political and social change. For Generation 5, transformative justice designates a model for creating liberatory responses to intimate and community violence. To quote from their Transformative Justice Handbook, the term transformative justice emerged directly out of Generation 5's work on child sexual abuse as the term that best describes the dual process of securing individual justice while transforming structures of social injustice that perpetuate such abuse. And I want to kind of really highlight that. So it's the dual process of both securing individual justice and also at the same time transforming structures of social injustice that perpetuate such abuse. They say while we develop this model as a response to child sexual abuse, we imagine transformative justice as an adoptable model that can and will be used to confront many other forms of violence in the systems of oppression they enable and require. And they define really the goals of transformative justice and break that down in terms of 5 goals, or particularly 4 goals. Transformative justice seeks to provide people who experience harm with immediate safety, long-term healing and reparations, while demanding that people who have done harm take accountability and mobilizing to shift oppressive social and systemic conditions. Excuse me. So to break that down, a first and primary goal is the safety and healing of people whom have experienced violence. When that goal is met, survivors are believed and adequately supported by their communities when they come forward. Ongoing harm is interrupted and new incidences of violence are prevented. It's also a goal that is pursued through restorative justice, as we've heard from the very beginning of this panel. A second goal is accountability and transformation for people who have abused and violated others. Accountability meaning that if I've harmed someone, I recognize the harm, I acknowledge its impacts, I make reparations, and I work toward personal development and transformation with the support of others so I do not hurt others again. And we've also heard about that in the ways that that is also pursued through restorative justice as well. A third goal for transformative justice is community response and accountability. And this goal means that networks of people become equipped in an ongoing way to respond to harm in ways that don't cause more harm. They know how to work together to provide support for survivors and other impacted people. They know how to hold harm doers accountable. They know how to transform problematic norms and social conditions without needing or involving the state. Mia Mingus, a founder of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, envisions community safety systems that operate independently for police and government systems, quote, where we could get help from the people in our everyday lives. And some of the work that's happening with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collectives gives some concrete examples of how this work is being carried out. They, for example, have labs in which people just even learn basic skills, such as how to give a good apology, labs on where people are taught kind of really active listening skills. And more in my everyday life, I've come to learn that we really don't have places where we learn these basic skills. So transformative justice approaches are seek to equip people with some of these everyday skills, including how we take accountability, right, when we harm others in everyday lives and even mundane and everyday ways. A fourth goal is to transform the community and shift the social conditions that create and perpetuate violence. This goal pushes communities to engage in practices such as community organizing, which can transform institutions and norms that operate through power over rather than power with frameworks. So for example, in the cases of sexual harm, it's community organizing that equips communities to learn about consent within institutions such as schools. It's community organizing to provide education around kind of patriarchy and how we transform that. It's community organizing that helps communities to cultivate the everyday norms, practices, and relationships that lead to healthy and sustainable communities. Transformative justice is also inextricably linked to and nested within a broader vision of a world, yes, for ending violence, including the violence of prisons and policing. So it's linked to the vision of prison abolition, a world without prisons, jails, and detention centers, a vision that is both critical and generative. And it's also connected to not only dismantling and changing existing systems, but building new non-retributive forms that are liberatory and transformative. And in the words of scholar and activist Andrea Smith, developing community-based responses to violence cannot rely on a romanticized notion of community that is not sexist, homophobic, or otherwise problematic. We cannot assume that there is even an intact community to begin with. Our political task then becomes to create communities of accountability. This emphasis on creating communities that can challenge all forms of violence rather than assuming these communities already exist is one area that distinguishes transformative justice from particularly conventional approaches to restorative justice. For example, that might assume that if we just bring the community together, they're going to take action against gender violence without recognizing the ways in which so many of our communities are actually implicit and complicit with gender violence and the systems of oppression that enable it. I've talked about kind of this focus on shifting conditions and another distinguishing factor. And of course, the fact that transformative justice in its contemporary form has emerged wholly from the insights, experiences, and visions of communities of color, especially women of color, many of whom are queer, as well as trans and gender nonconforming people of color. It's keenly attentive to multiple forms of violence and interlocking systems of oppression that lead to violence in its many forms as a result. And I want to just end now with an example of practice that has emerged from this work. Thea shared about the ways in which she learned a number of examples of organizations and the work that has informed the work that she's doing through traveling and visiting with these organizations during a fellowship. And I had a very similar experience. Some years after I joined the Insight Washington, D.C. chapter, I wanted to learn more about these approaches. And I had the opportunity to travel to a few US cities on a fellowship to learn about the work that they were doing. And one of the first organizations that hosted me is an organization that was set up intentionally to be a short-term organization called Creative Interventions. Creative Interventions embodies the critical race feminist principles that I've discussed earlier around kind of that I, abbreviated as PRISM, plurality, placement, planted, and practice. And it also reflects this core value of centering the knowledge and power of everyday people, especially those directly impacted by violence, a core value that's shared by restorative and transformative justice approaches. Creative Interventions was created in the California Bay Area as an initiative to develop creative community-based strategies for reducing intimate violence, particularly intimate partner violence. And it's a project that has focused particularly on intervention, on intervening when this violence is already happening. It was started by Mimi Kim, a social worker at the time, who's now a professor of social work, with particular long-term experience and practice in working to accompany and support, particularly within Asian immigrant communities experiencing, Asian immigrant women especially experiencing domestic violence. And Rachel Herzing is another key collaborator in founding this project with long-term experience and practice in prison abolition work. And so they came together with others. And as part of the project, they partnered with local Asian immigrant anti-violence organizations. They found that, of course, many people in these who went to these organizations, went to crisis intervention organizations, who were a part of these, sought these networks out for support, did not want to involve the police, and they were unable to leave their home, but they did want to, of course, have the abuse to stop. And so they became a resource. Creative Interventions became a resource for anyone who was in that situation but chose not to, or were not able to involve the police for reasons that we heard and discussed earlier, particularly in relation to the experiences of immigrant women. And with this, we hear principles of kind of PRISM and plurality in terms of the intersections of identity, gender, race, immigration status. Plurality, the placing immigrant women at the center, the ways in which acknowledging the state as a source of violence, and also practice, the ways in which tools and strategies were created during in the process of these interventions. So let me just kind of summarize a little bit about what they did, tell you how you can learn more to close. Creative Interventions asked people who came to them for support to identify additional people that they believe could help to intervene in this situation. The team member from their group would meet with the entire group of people who were then convened as possible people to intervene, and the person requesting support to facilitate dialogue and action planning. And the team of Creative Interventions created a number of tools to assist with action planning. Tools such as how do we get clear on what is happening, tools around safety planning, tools around kind of what can be done to intervene to stop the violence. For example, going to someone's home and having a practice where people take turns to be in the home for someone who is unable to or doesn't want to leave. And also tools for helping people to figure out who can confront the person who's being abusive. They asked the group that was convened questions, and they provided them with tools, again, to help them figure out what was going on, what their goals were, and how safety could be established, how accountability could be provided. And the organizing model really focuses on getting people together to collectively not only identify the objectives to take action to assess their impacts. They facilitated cases in this way over a 3-year period. At the end of the 3 years, they compiled the tools and resources that they developed in a toolkit. You can see a cover page of the toolkit here. It's over 600 pages long. You can find it at creativeinterventions.org, but I also recently learned that they collaborated with an organization in New Zealand to make this available on a website there as well. And I'll just show you that website so that you can learn more. And so the website that you can see here, they did this in collaboration with an organization in New Zealand. And it's called Tools to Stop Violence, and you can see their toolkit, and particularly that it's a facilitated approach, and they have tools for facilitators throughout the website. here. So I won't go through it here, but it's a wonderful resource, and it's a resource as you can, as that is highlighted here, that really focuses on a community-based intervention and reflects the framework of transformative justice. So to return to the earlier words of legal scholar Angela P. Harris, transformative justice is an ideal that resembles restorative justice infused with the politics and principles of critical race feminism. For me, it resonates with my lived experiences and values as a Black woman, my faith as a follower of Jesus, and my politics as a prison abolitionist, and my experience as a sexual abuse survivor. It also captures my political imagination, and I hope that it is incited yours as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. This is now brings us to the point where we have questions for each of our panelists. Dr. Julie, Solicitor Deacon Greenwood, Carolyn Stauffer, Dr. Stauffer, Dr. Turner. So we're open to questions from participants who have been with us, as well as panelists can also ask each other questions. And I have a question that has come in, so if it's okay with you, I will start. And I'll ask this in general to the panelists here. The question has to do with whether or not we know of resources in Spanish that are there authors who've written in Spanish or translations in Spanish on transformative justice and its application in traumatized communities. I'm not sure, probably either Dr. Turner or Dr. Stauffer we start with you and see what you have to say, and maybe the other two panelists would have something to comment as well.
I can place some. I'm not sure if the person is in our Zoom room or not, because I may be able to provide a link in the chat. The Creative Interventions Toolkit that I shared, I think that there might be some parts of that toolkit, if not the entirety, available in Spanish. I can check on that. So that would be one resource.
You may want to put that on anyway, even though the question came through YouTube, so that wouldn't be visible, but somebody may be able to pass it on who is on Zoom here. So why don't you just put it in the chat if you can. Okay, any other comments on that?
I'll just say that, just to add that it is available in Spanish. It was actually done by an anonymous Spanish feminist collective. They translated the toolkit into Spanish, and you can find that since for those of you on YouTube accessing this, you can find that at creativeinterventions.org, and there's a link on that page where you can find the entire toolkit available in Spanish called Caja de Herramientas.
Good.
So that's one wonderful resource.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, and that's the 600-page workbook, right? Or manual. So it's thorough. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, here's another question that has come in. This asks about how you take on or address violence, sexual violence in communities like the Amish or other communities that are closed communities in a sense, or very religious communities. Any comments from any of you on experiences that you might have or that you know of in terms of how to do that, how to address sexual violence in communities such as the Amish or other groups who are very closed groups, okay.
Yeah, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to jump in on that?
No, you go first, Carolyn.
Okay. Just to say that I think finding those resources within the community structure that are legitimated for those types of functions is really important. And in the case that the example that I gave, it was the midwives. But for instance, I did some research on Hasidic Jewish communities. I did some research on the Jesus People communities of Chicago. And interestingly enough, each of these contexts, it was really about how power and hierarchy was leveraged. And so, for instance, in the Amish community, in that religious structure, the women did not disclose to the matriarchs because ironically, it was the mothers and the older women who tended to silence the disclosures to keep the system in place. So older men and older women weren't those points of connection for disclosure and support. It was medical practitioners and people from outside the system. So again, finding those legitimated people within the system and or having external accountability structures as well, I think is key.
Okay, Thea, did you have something you were going to add?
Yes, I was just going to find a link and add it to the chat as well. I mean, the only thing I was going to add is in my experience with the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual assault, many of the the case studies which were publicly screened, like a hearing or of inquiry, really looked at that issue. And I really echo what Carolyn is saying in terms of having key people in those communities who understand the complexity and the particular circumstances and the cultural contexts and hierarchies in those communities are key. Finding those people and supporting them from outside, it can be very, very challenging work to do. But some of the learnings that came through the Royal Commission and the recommendations from it really go to that point particularly. And there's a large report which was published from it, and I'll share the link to that, which might be helpful because they looked at a very wide range of different communities. They looked at, sporting institutions, religious sects, what might be considered cults or more closed communities. And there's a lot of learnings that came from the lived experience of survivors speaking out about what had been helpful for them. So I just recommend that to anybody if they haven't looked at that before, to look at that in a bit more detail for some learnings too.
Two resources, just building on what Thea is sharing. The one is the work of Dr. Jennifer Freud, Freud, and she talks about institutional betrayal and the idea that it's not just people that betray us in situations of sexual harm, but oftentimes the complicity and the silencing and the erasure of primary institution means that survivors feel a double impact of betrayal. So Dr. Jennifer Freud's work, as well as Dr. Marie Keenan from the Irish context, she looks at Catholic sexual abuse within the church context, and she highlights a number, as Thea said, a number of interesting findings, one of which is that when sexual harm happens within an institutional context, not just one-on-one, but in an institutional context, the harms done in terms of the trauma indice are much higher, A, and B, people tend to disclose, as Thea mentioned, much later. So again, these are the dynamics of organizational, institutional life and how they contribute to harms done.
Okay, thank you. These are possibly follow-ons to what you've already mentioned, but there's particular interest in how we support victims so that they're able to come out and denounce the things that have happened. This question is related to that. What would you recommend to support victims of gender-based violence in universities, both in public universities or in universities that are part of a religious community or order? Any experiences or comments you would like to make in terms of recommendations beyond what you might already said, or you may want to reiterate something you've said. Shirley, I don't know if you have anything, or from your experience at the university, several universities that you worked at, I don't know whether you have anything to report from that.
I think having a very clear pathway of disclose how people can disclose, and I think also having regular training on disclosure of sexual violence for both students and staff, because it could be, I mean, most universities have counselling and student support processes and people available, but it's been my experience that people tend to disclose to a lecturer in the university environment. So it's being knowing, you know, that lecturer, that person must be the person who understands what to do next, you know, that they're not a counsellor, they're not an expert in sexual in victimization of sexual violence, and they should support that student to be able to access the services the university has. Mm-hmm. In a case that I was involved in, I accompanied a student at the end of my lecture to the Health and Wellbeing Centre of the university and helped them to make an appointment to see a counsellor. Mm-hmm. Well, it didn't help really, I just supported.
I'll just add to that if that's okay. I'd point to the work as well of Dr. David Karp, who's at the University of San Diego now, who's developed the PRISM, Campus PRISM program, and I'll just share some links for that as well. It's a very live issue, obviously, that abuse and assault that takes place on campus between students, as well as from senior lecturers to students, is a very complex problem. And obviously universities have got their own disciplinary standards and processes to go through. But I would again say that we need to listen to the experiences of survivors and to truly ask them what it is they want, and that doesn't necessarily mean a very punitive response from the university of taking somebody's education away from them, but that we can do that work in different ways, and that the same barriers that apply for anybody reporting to police is what even college situations have got. There's some work in Australia through a program called Respect Now Always, which is taking place in universities. And Jane and I have addressed one of their conferences with the leaders of a number of different universities in our state who are seeking to use restorative practices internally and to train facilitators within university settings. So I would just recommend David Karp's work to people and the work that he does as well.
Thank you.
Let me just add to that I was thinking about what Dr. Turner talked about. I love that verbiage of creating communities of accountability and support, and how that, especially in undergraduate and graduate student context, the way that people perceive risks might be very different. So folks might perceive reputational risks in our digital world around disclosure as their highest risks. And so how do we create those systems of support around folks that are working through a process of restoration in their lives?
Okay. Any other questions or comments that you might want to make? Any of the panelists that you want to add to what you've already said, or suggest other resources before we close our session? Shirley, will you?
I think I would like to just draw attention to the fact that the statistics point to very high prevalence and incidence of sexual violence, that people who are sexually violated as children tend to go on, are 50% more likely to go on to become sexually violated as adults or to enter into intimate partner violence relationships. So I think that anybody who sort of ignores that there could be high levels of sexual violence in any one of our communities, and it's likely to be higher in communities which are closed, which are marginalized, I think we're asking for trouble. And I think it's something that we need to take seriously. Thea mentioned about the attrition rates in people who report to the police. We know that more than 90% of us will report our car stolen, but less than 10% of us will report our bodies violated. And I think that 10% who might report to the police, the attrition rate is, as Thea pointed out, is staggering. So very many people don't end up in being convicted of a crime. So any kind of alternative pathway for experience a sense of justice is incredibly important and will have huge paybacks for our societies and communities.
Yeah, did you put in the chat your comment? The question here is if we could put in the chat the what you just mentioned, the initiative that you mentioned, Thea. You're muted, so we can't hear you.
Sorry, yes, I have done that, but we're also maybe it'll be useful to produce some links as an outcome of this conference to share with people through different platforms, if that's helpful.
Okay.
I'm happy to put together some of those resources that we have maybe all contributed to.
That would be nice, and then we could make sure that Delvia gets it so that we can include it as part of the products of this particular session.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yes, Elvia is very much supportive of your idea.
Okay, no problem.
I have back channel communications here, so I'm sorry about that.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we're approaching the end of our time. We have a minute or two, a couple of minutes here yet. If you have other thoughts or if there are other questions. It looks like we're maybe at the end of the road today. So I found it, thank you very much, each of the panelists. I found it really, really quite inspiring. I don't hate to admit this, but it's even exceeded my expectations, which were very high to begin with. But this is very good. Thank you very much. And I enjoyed the mix of Australia, New Zealand, the US, all kinds of different things here. So, so thank you very much. And thanks to the conference organizers for giving us this space. And I will remind you, I think it was mentioned already, that Dr. Turner, Johanna, as we call her, our friends call her, will be giving us another presentation on the 12th, I believe. And I believe it's at this same time. Is that correct? I believe it is. I should check the time on that, but I think it's also at this same block in the session on the 12th of November. So thank you all again. Elvia, did you have any comments closing comments you want to make?
Si no hay comentarios de nuestras panelistas, ¿algo que quisieran agregar? Bueno, Si no lo hay, les
I
agradecemos
think we've
muchísimo
said
este
everything we had
panel.
to say.
Pues fue maravilloso. Nos quedamos con ganas de seguir escuchando todas estas experiencias. Muchísimas gracias a todas. Muchísimas gracias, doctor, a Vernon, a Elena Joder, por habernos ayudado con esta coordinación de este fantástico panel. Estuvo excelente, les agradecemos mucho. Fue muy interesante. Y bueno, pues les mandamos un abrazo a todas, hasta Nueva Zelanda, a Shirley Hulich, nuestra querida Shirley, fue un gusto volverte a ver. Un abrazo a Australia también, a Tía. Y bueno, a Virginia, a la Eastern Mennonite University, a todas por allá. Un abrazo muy grande y bueno, pues por aquí seguimos en lo que sigue del Congreso. No se pierdan mañana a las 7 de la mañana tenemos un panel a las 9 de la mañana, perdón, mañana a las 9 de la mañana hora de México tenemos un panel sobre género, derechos humanos, paz y deportes que hemos organizado con Peace and Sport. Va a estar muy interesante. Tenemos ponentes de Países Bajos, de Francia, de Mónaco, de diferentes, de Portugal. Entonces, ojalá puedan acompañarnos y para escucharlo hay que entrar a nuestro link de Zoom, pues solamente allá adentro habrá traducción. Muchísimas gracias y nos vemos mañana. Un abrazo grande. Hasta allá. Querido doctor, un abrazo grande.
Thank you. Bye.